Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Good morning, church. Well, do the scriptures have your attention yet? Some years ago, I met, through a mutual friend, a woman named Marilyn Mellows. Marilyn was then a producer for WGBH in Boston and had been one of the forces behind a Frontline documentary, From Jesus to Christ, the First Christians. Marilyn's goal was to open current Jesus scholarship to a wider audience, and she had by then spent a great deal of time in Israel and in the Palestinian West Bank. Marilyn had gathered hours of footage, interviews with leading Jesus and New Testament scholars from around the world. I was so curious about her work, and I wanted to know, as we talked together, how all of that study and interviewing and filming had changed her relationship to Jesus or broadened it. Marilyn hesitated for a moment. I think the personal pitch of my question took her aback. So at first she used an image from the gospel. She said, "I sometimes feel as if I'm in a boat offshore, and he is this figure walking on the beach." And then she thought some more and said, we have 4 Gospels and other sources. So it's as if you're sitting with someone, but looking at them through a kaleidoscope instead of face to face. The image Marilyn gave me was one of intimacy, sitting with someone, but also an image of color and movement and, truth be told, a kind of shape-shifting. This morning's gospel, for example, part of Matthew's account of his charge to the disciples, should give you serious pause and is of a shade and tone that's at first at violent odds with the Jesus you may have grown to prefer. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. This is not the humble, foot-washing Jesus, the forgiving, feed my lambs Jesus. Deeper into Matthew's gospel, Jesus himself will forbid violence in the starkest possible terms after one of his followers cuts off the ear of the slave of the high priest. You remember that. Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. So what are we to do with this Jesus we meet in Matthew this June morning? When I consider Marilyn's image, and as I've sat this week with this most challenging episode from Matthew's Gospel, I've been mindful that even those we believe we know best can surprise us or seem in moments to contradict themselves. With anyone we love, we have to lean in certain moments on the longer story, our stored, accumulated knowledge of that beloved person, in order to absorb, to understand, to reconcile a mystifying or even threatening action or outburst. Revelation is what happens when you read Scripture. Revelation is what happens when you read Scripture, said the great Protestant theologian of the last century, Karl Barth. And that's a very Protestant piece of guidance. No one else owns or governs your relationship with Jesus Christ. This is why we're told to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Now, scholarship and the witness of others are important, even necessary supports for you, but Marilyn's image persists. You have to pick up the kaleidoscope yourself, peer into it prayerfully, and begin to assemble and build a relationship from the color and the movement you see. This morning's lessons pile on vivid color and sharp shapes. We've met the prophet Jeremiah, in part angry with God, dejected and isolated, at serious odds with those around him who mock him. Terror, he says, is all around. Jeremiah uses the language of addiction and compulsive attachment to his relationship with the God of Israel. He can't shut up about God. If I say I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, then there is within me something like a burning fire shut up in my bones. What an image! A burning fire shut up in one's bones. Disunity and discord is the order of Jeremiah's day. They also pervade the voice of the psalmist, who has become a stranger to her own kindred, an alien to her mother's other children. Finally, the sword Jesus claims to bear hacks away at what are, ostensibly, our most intimate relationships. Sons set against fathers, daughters against mothers. So not the feeding Jesus, not the foot-washing Jesus. Terror all around, it would seem. One's foes in one's own household is how Jesus puts it. What Jesus is also doing this morning, although he doesn't give us the citation directly, is quote directly from the prophet Micah. Now, I'd like to share some of Micah with you this morning because I think the unfiltered words of that prophet will give you a deeper understanding both of Jeremiah's lament and Jesus' guidance to his disciples and through them to us. Woe is me, says Jeremiah, says Micah. Woe is me, for I have become like one who, after the summer fruit has been gathered, after the vintage has been gleaned, finds no cluster to eat. There is no first ripe fig for which I hunger. The faithful have disappeared from the land, and there is no one left who is upright. They all lie in wait for blood, and they hunt each other with nets. Their hands are skilled to do evil. The official and the judge ask for a bribe, and the powerful dictate what they desire. Thus they pervert justice. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright of them a thorn hedge. The day of their sentinels, of their punishment has come. Now their confusion is at hand. Put no trust in a friend. Have no confidence in a loved one. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your embrace. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies are members of your own household. But as for me, concludes the prophet, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Sound like a movement you want to join? Now, the voice of Micah, the voice of Jeremiah, the voice of Jesus this morning are primarily voices of outraged protest. They are concerned with a culture that has abandoned a covenant relationship with God, a culture that has forgotten the value of neighborliness. And if you listen carefully, Jesus is not saying this morning, abandon your nuclear family. One of God's first commandments, after all, has to do with honoring one's parents. What Jesus seems to me to be saying is, your idea of family is not wide enough or generous enough. And because of that, the world and the culture are at risk. The values of the kingdom I am proclaiming are at odds with that of the culture in which you are entrapped. Life is cheap in the dominant earthly culture in which these prophets lived. Sparrows, Jesus says, are the cheapest birds sold in the temple. So a God who remains in intimate relationship with even those tiny birds whose lives are cheap to human culture remains in intimate, neighborly relationship with you and with your foes, who are actually also your brothers and sisters, members, these other humans, of your own household. Now that's a lot to take in. But it has nothing to do with violence or weaponry. The weapons of our warfare are not fleshly, Paul will say in his second letter to the Corinthians. And the sword Jesus speaks of this morning is not the sword of violence and death, but perhaps something more like a machete. Its purpose to hack away all that blocks our faith and inhibits our growth in love. The fire shut up in the prophet's bones is love. And prophetic words in Scripture are less about predicting the future than they are about calling us back to our best, to our most generous, to our most loving selves. Liberating the love within us and freeing us from attachments that cripple our compassion, our generosity, and our courage. Have no fear of them, says Jesus this morning. So do not be afraid, says Jesus this morning. What Paul this morning in Romans calls newness of life is imminent if you can trust in it. Some of your fears might be justified, but as many of them, if not more of your fears, are based on illusion, misinformation, fake news, and ignorance of a wider, more generous picture. What Jesus is often telling his disciples is that their perspective isn't big enough. Look up. You tend to be clannish. Who are my brothers and sisters, he will ask. These, everyone here, are my brothers and my sisters. Family, society, the earth itself will flourish. Families will flourish if you lift up your heads and open your eyes and embrace the way of love. Resurrection, newness of life, is, in this understanding, a continuing cycle for us, both before we die and after we die, into our own final futures. The idea, then, is to die during this life, that is, to release old understandings of ourselves and others, old habits, old manners of living, so that we can be made new. Jesus seems to be saying that we've been confusing peace with a kind of isolated self-satisfaction. Those are different things. And it's that illusion he has come to disrupt. I loved my own children, of course. Said Ruth Campbell to me last week. She was telling me about a certain set of experiences she had had around 1971 to 1974. She was a young mother who was founding a daycare center in Billerica, Massachusetts. And she was beginning then to put together a model that became what we know as Food for Kids. I loved my own children, of course, but I somehow needed something more. Is it too much to claim that the fire then shut up in Ruth's bones all those years ago was a kind of love that embraced her own children and at the same time was broader than her own flesh and blood? That Ruth felt her own values of love and care and feeding to be out of sync with those of the wider world that preach that there is no such thing as a free lunch. That she decided to take a small first step, securing government feeding funding for the small number of children, other people's children, then in her care. Feed my sheep. Feed my lambs. Jesus' words from John's Gospel are operative texts for Ruth when she looks through that kaleidoscope. That's what she perceives. And the understanding at work through the prophets and through Jesus, and now into our own shared life as God's people here in Orleans, is that private lives are not wide enough to be kingdom lives. Private lives are not wide enough to be kingdom lives. Perhaps you noticed this morning that both Jesus and Jeremiah end these diatribes on a certain sudden, jarring up note. Deliverance. New life. I was curious in talking to Ruth last week as Food for Kids is preparing for its 10th summer, kicking off this week, to hear about how she pulled off a ministry that at one point was feeding 2,000 children daily in greater Springfield, Massachusetts, and is now guiding others, us, her successors, now. Her answer struck me for an instant as kind of oddly circular. She said, "Food for Kids helps me do Food for Kids. Food for Kids helps me do Food for Kids." Do you understand what she's saying? It's sort of circular. It's its own reward. It's another way of something that's circular and also true. God made us for the love of God. God made us for the love of God. For new life out of death. We are most alive when we are most loving, dying to self, when other people's children somehow become our own